Hey everyone, I have another great episode for you today. I have the lovely author Katherine Rothschild on the podcast with me. She tells us all about her novel, Wider Than the Sky, gives some really great advice for querying authors, and likens drafting to dating. And it was kind of a game changer. So make sure you listen in and maybe get a notepad ready to take some notes. She's quite wonderful, and her book, Wider Than the Sky, comes out on the 19th of this month, so make sure that you pre-order that. Katherine, can you tell me about your novel, Wider Than the Sky?
Sure. So Wider Than the Sky is about twin sisters who are dealing with secrets about their parents' sexual identities and finding a way to reimagine what an inclusive family looks like. It's set in the fall in the Bay Area, and it features cold winds and leaf crunching and a lot of lesser-known Bay Area locations like Berkeley Cornice's Rose Gardens and the San Francisco AIDS Memorial Grove. It's set in a fictional town called Thornwood, but the locations are based on real places in the Bay Area. And the story is essentially twin sisters dealing with things completely differently and then finding a way to bring their visions of what their family should be together.
Wow.
With a subplot of romance. So.
Oh, yeah. That sounds amazing. Wow, that seems like something too, like, I don't know necessarily that I've heard of a premise like this, just from what I've read, and I know that there's so many books out there, so it's like I might have missed it. But that sounds awesome, and probably, like, you'll be able to give a lot of people a book where they can see themselves in it, right? And maybe something that they've dealt with, they're like, oh gosh, here it is. I can kind of fictionalize it and work through it, which is the wonderful thing about reading.
Absolutely.
That's wonderful. And I love leaf crunching and fall. I love it when the environment is very, clear in a book. That sounds awesome. Well, tell me a little bit about your journey to getting published to this point where you have your book coming out into the world.
So, yeah, there's always a journey. I think the key word is journey.
Journey, yes.
So I want to say right up front that I always wanted to be a writer, when I was a kid and growing up. And I actually had the chance to sign with a lit agent when I was really young, I think I was about 23, and I didn't yet have a book completed, but I really didn't understand what signing with an agent even meant. She'd seen my short stories at a conference, and she wanted to help me work on a book of short stories, but I didn't have the confidence to follow through with it. So I think what's really interesting to me about my personal journey is that it was really more of a journey to feeling like I was a writer or could be a writer, because there were actually opportunities in front of me that I didn't take because I wasn't really ready for them.
Yeah.
And eventually it was the internet that made it easy to communicate and send materials, because back then when I was just I was just still in a graduate program or just out of my MFA program, which I went to right after college. So I think it was 22 or 23 when I graduated from that. I had this interest in my short stories, which have never gone anywhere really. And what happened was I just didn't feel like I was a writer. I just got cold feet about being a writer. And you might think that I would kick myself for this, but I actually think I was waiting to figure out the kind of author that I wanted to be, or that I felt like I was, and not imitating sort of what you were taught in an MFA program,
right?
What I thought I should be.
Yeah.
And eventually I realized kind of when I had been writing a historical fiction for a while, and I kind of couldn't seal the deal on this first draft. I just couldn't figure out what happened at the end, and what I had planned just wasn't working. And I had to put it aside. It was very historical, lots of information to keep in your head, and I put it aside. And I read a book that my friend Jen Chambliss-Bertman, who's New York Times bestseller of the Book Scavenger books, and she sent me a book that was a young adult novel, And I read it and I thought, oh, wait a minute. Okay, this is the kind of author I want to be. I want to be a children's book author. Young adult isn't really a genre, right? It's a categorization based on the age of the character. And it's about a time in your life that's really challenging and really confusing. And I found that was what I wanted to write about. So even when I finally wrote a full manuscript and polished it and revised it and queried, I had several more false starts. But eventually it really was only when I knew who I wanted to be as a writer that I ended up with, agent offers and then selling the book.
I love it. I love that that's your perspective on the journey too, because I feel like you could look at it from the way of oh, dang it, I missed my shot at 23. I should have signed with that agent, and then look where I would have been now. But I think there is so much to say for taking the time to truly find out who you want to be as an author, the stories you want to tell, the perspective you want to come from. And, I think as you grow, you learn so much more as a human being, and that helps you so much as an author too. I love that that's your perspective on your journey. That's wonderful.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So tell me a little bit about querying, because querying's the worst for most people, right? It's just a hard part of the journey for most people. So tell me how you approached it, and then any tips you have for writers who are in the querying process right now.
So I'm kind of laughing already because I have I have a lot to say about querying. I think that the first thing is that I really approach querying and talking to people about querying as a mindset. And I've written a couple posts about querying, which you can see on my website which is kathrothschild.com. But I just want to sort of break down how I approached it and how I feel like it can be successful for anybody. And there's just no trick to querying other than mindsets. But the first thing I'll say is there is actually a way, a method I think works best when you're querying. And that's that, this is how I approached it, is that you can definitely, you've got to have a finished book, obviously. You have to have that, polished, finished book that you have. So you have a polished, finished book that you have gone through beta readers and gone through a writing group and critique and all those things, and then responded to it. So obviously that's where you start, right? Yeah. And then from there, I was told the best advice I think that I've ever gotten, which was, and this is really hard, it's the hardest thing to do, but just send out 3 queries. Ooh. And send out, just 3. And the 3 is choose 3 agents who ask for 3 different things. One wants just the query. And you really have to kind of look for this, but there are somebody who will just want a query, somebody who just wants a query and pages, and then another one who wants query, pages, and synopsis. And the reason you should do that is because first, you will have those materials prepared, right? So probably the 3 different types, and sometimes the page lengths are different, 15 pages here, 40 pages there, but it's, you have the pages already. It's really the query and having a synopsis and making sure you have that ready before you go into the trenches. And then second, if you send out 3 and your query is rejected, but your query and your pages are not, and then your query and pages the second time maybe are or aren't, something, and that's that your query might need work, right? For those folks who only ask for a query, the query is not working well enough for you. If you reject for all 3, probably work on the query and probably work on the pages. If you get the first 2, but the synopsis doesn't get picked up, that maybe that either the way you've written the synopsis isn't working, or that maybe there might be a problem in sort of the second half of the book. So I really encourage people to do that. And then the worst part about it, wait, see what happens. That's the worst part. And it can be forever, like, especially right now in the world, it could take a really long time. So that is the hardest thing. And, don't just sit on your laurels. Like, I always encourage everybody, like, write your next book, keep working on revisions, whatever you're doing, keep doing it. But for me, I got 2 full requests with my first 3, and my query only got rejected. Or I think maybe it was the opposite. But so I knew that my query was strong. I knew that my pages were drawing people in. But then the first fulls I got turned into passes. So when I think about, like, when you're in the query trenches, it's really, really, really hard to keep going because there's so much rejection. So when I think about it as far as mindset theory, like, when you're approaching querying, like, say you've done your first due diligence and sent out the first 3 and you've kind of revised accordingly, join Query Tracker, understand that the stats are grim. The average query results are 5%. That means that for every 100 queries, you'll get 5 requests for more materials. And that wasn't the case for me. I think it was closer to 30% for me. And I know several authors who feel like the stats are more like 30%. So for every 10 queries, 3 will come back asking for something more, or a full. But the truth is, we're up against a lot of rejection. And I think the way that you think about it is that when you query someone, it's like a lukewarm sales call. It's not like you met somebody at a party and you exchanged a phone number with them. They're interested in manuscripts, but maybe they're interested in yours and maybe not. Yeah. So it never bothered me too much if I queried someone and I got a pass. Yeah. And it shouldn't bother anybody.
Right.
But then if you do query somebody and you get a full and then you get a pass, that's tougher, right? But the mindset then, if you're getting full requests, the mindset is that you have something, maybe you need to make it better, but the concept, the pages, they're all looking good enough that someone's paying attention. And that needs to move into the mindset of, like, this is probably going to happen for me. It's just a matter of time and really listening to any feedback that I get. And that listening to feedback, taking the time to revise. When I think about it, I probably did 8 revisions during the year that I queried.
Wow.
And I ended up with something like 28 full requests and 4 agent offers.
That's amazing. That's a lot of revisions in that year, though.
Yeah, and I mean, not all of them were huge revisions. Like, there was one comment from an agent that, like, I loved this, but I feel like the dialogue could be snappier. So I spent, 4 or 5 hours just going through and fine-tuning every piece of dialogue.
Yeah.
Just like looking at it and really figuring it out. So I think that, it doesn't have to be this huge thing. Although I would say, easily 8 times I kind of went back and revised before sending out. And I think that's really the process that I think the mindset I think everyone should take into querying, is that querying is not about throwing your book at the wall so many times that it finally sticks.
Yeah.
It's about taking the time to listen to agents, to, like, pay attention and read the room, test the waters, whatever analogy you want to make, and then revise with those things in mind, and let a year or 2 or even 3 of querying make your writing better, make your book better, make you a stronger, more confident writer. And then I think it's not wasted time. It's time that you've put toward your career.
I think that, again, you have such a great perspective on these things, because I love the comment you made about how, it's like lukewarm cold calling, right? Like, if an agent passes on just your query, like, it shouldn't be that heartbreaking. But a lot that can be, I feel like, heartbreaking for a lot of people, the rejections from queries. But then you gave that great advice of just sending out 3 queries to agents who want 3 different things. And that is a way of getting feedback without getting feedback from them. Because, right, they send form rejections a lot of the times. But if you do that really helps you kind of narrow down the pieces that you need to work on. That's a great great tip for people.
Yeah, that was originally from the author Karina Vacco, who wrote My Chemical Mountain, one of my all-time favorite books. And she helped me when I was querying. And that's the one thing that I think really helped me figure out, okay, what do I need to work on?
Yeah, that's wonderful. Well, thank you for that. I'd love to know a two-parter question. I'd love to know what the hardest part of writing is for you, and then the hardest part of being an author.
So yeah, I mean, I think the first thing is those are two different things, right? Being a writer is a really different thing from being an author. And a lot of people who have debut books coming out are blindsided a little bit by what it is to be an author versus what it is to just write a book.
Yeah.
And writing a book, I love to write. I even love, I don't like writing on deadline. I don't think anybody does, but
No.
I do love revision too. I like tweaking things, and I kind of have to stop myself at a certain point from
Yes.
really going into the weeds too much. But I love writing. The hardest part is sort of an ongoing self-doubt that, we all have. I think there's been some really funny tweets that talk about first thought, this manuscript is amazing. And then second thought, this manuscript is pretty good. And then, oh my gosh, this is a pile of garbage. And then, no, it's fine. Okay, I can fix this. It's wonderful again. So this is always the process that your brain goes through. And I think just knowing that, so that when your brain is telling you that you have written a trash fire, that you can be like, it's a trash fire that I can put out, and then I'm going to rehab this trash can with a mosaic or something. So you have to sort of have that mentality about it and understand that that's the writer's process, and it's just part of the deal. But being an author, speaking, talking to schools, doing interviews, those kinds of things, those are tough because you have suddenly this group of people in the world paying attention to what you've written. And of course, the first feedback I've gotten from early readers is oh, is this you? Is this your family? or people who know me reading it and saying, oh, I can really see you in the main character, which I think is really funny because, as any other author will know, first of all, my friend Nina LaCour, who has a book that just came out, she's a very famous author. Hopefully everybody knows her, but her new book is called Watch Over Me. And, she said, everyone is going to think you're writing about yourself. So just write whatever you want, which is totally true, but so I think it's really just dealing with that, what I think of sort of ridiculousness from the world. People saying that they did not finish the book because they didn't like the font, or, saying, it was set in the Bay Area and there's such left-wing liberals that I don't want to read that book. It's kind of again, I feel like it's a mindset, is just being able to consistently say, okay, not everybody has to like my book. Not everybody has to understand what I've done, and that's okay. Yeah. That's the toughest part, to remind yourself of that.
That can definitely be so hard when you've spent so much time in that world with those characters. I mean, writing is a very personal thing. So, letting it out loose in the world, you have zero control over it anymore, and you have zero control over what people say about it. That is definitely difficult. Well, let me flip that question on you. What's the best part for you of being a writer and being an author?
So I think being a writer is awesome. Generally, people are very impressed by it. When I say oh yeah, I have a book coming out. Oh, wow, yeah. I want to write a book someday. And everybody can write a book. Anybody can write a book. It just takes time and energy. But I like talking about writing with people. I teach at Stanford University, and I teach writing, and I love talking to my colleagues about writing. I love talking to my students about writing. So I think the best part of being a writer and an author is to get to talk about it all the time, and I love that.
It is the best. And I think there is a certain like fascination that people have with authors and writers, and you know, the large majority of people don't understand how the process works either. So like you say, oh, I'm working on a book or I'm writing a book, and they're like, oh, cool, let me read it right now. Like, when can I buy it? In 2 years, maybe.
That is totally the truth. Like, it is really funny that the number of people who are like, well, is it going to be made into a film? Like,
right.
As if, I love that, like, that moment of shortcut. Like, well, I don't really want to read your book, but I definitely want to judge it. So
Yes.
can I watch it?
So funny. Well, I'd love to know your writing style. So do you like to pants it a little bit more? Are you a big planner, or do you fall somewhere in between?
So my first book was pantsed, and it was insane how much I had to revise that book. The first book I totally finished, not the first book I attempted to finish. And that's kind of like this big demarcation, I feel like, in the writing world. You really can't become a writer until you finish a complete first draft of a whole book. And sometimes that's easy for people, and sometimes it takes a long time. And for me, it took a long time. And part of that was because I was pantsing. So after my first book, I've written four more books, which is sort of like one of these funny things that, like, the book that is coming out right now, Wider Than the Sky, is a book I finished 4 years ago. So in that time, just because publishing and COVID, like, it was pushed and there were complications, but I had a great experience. It's just, it took a long time to come out. And so I've written a lot since then, and every other book I have written has been planned. And I do feel like that there are ways that you can be more successful when you're writing if you think about your characters before you write. Really work on that. I love how Daniel Levy, who is, if you don't know, one of the writers and creators of Schitt's Creek, and
only like the best
he
person
had an
in the
interview
world
with his dad, Daniel did, with his dad, Eugene Levy. And what he said was, we worked on just who the characters were for 6 months before writing down any of the story. And I think that shows in the mastery of that television show. And I work to emulate that. So I always do a beat sheet, which is the Blake Snyder beat sheet, which, if you're interested in learning more about that, there's a great book called Save the Cat Writes a Novel. And it talks about sort of how to plot, essentially. And there are a lot of different ways. There's no one right way. But I think really knowing the characters well, doing character interviews, doing setting interviews, doing a lot of pre-writing, and then writing out that beat sheet and then starting. That's how I do it now. And I think I have a lot fewer drafts because of it. So, but that said, I always tell everyone who I talk to, there's no one way to write. Some people really can't find creativity, or what I think of as creative flow, when they do use an outline. So
yeah, I love that you bring that up, that it's like everybody kind of has to figure it out for themselves, right? And I more lean towards a pantser than a planner, and that is hard because I do have to revise so much more. But I definitely feel that like lack of creativity when I plan too much. But I have found, that I do like a rough first draft and then do the planning kind of after the fact, and that helps me kind of work through that process. But I love hearing about other authors' styles, because there's always something to learn from, and maybe a new trick to try if you're still kind of trying to figure out your process.
Absolutely. I always recommend a character interview, like, at any point in the process, too. Yeah. If you're having trouble with plot, I always say go back to the character. It's not necessarily the plot, but that the character doesn't have agency or isn't asserting their agency, and that's the problem with the plot. It's not, the plot itself is nothing. It's the character and what they do in the world.
Definitely. Well, I love that. Thank you for that answer. So you did mention that, you've loved writing for a really long time. Can you tell me a little bit about when your love of writing began?
Yeah, I mean, I really have, like, my identity has always been as a writer. And there was actually a very funny moment when, I have my high school boyfriend, or one of my high school boyfriends, it lives in another country now and isn't really sort of in the loop, but saw on Facebook my book was coming out, and he wrote me saying, "Oh my gosh," and he's a creative too. He sort of does magic and presentation, big kind of shows. And he said, it takes such a long time, doesn't it? You've loved this for so long. You've wanted this for so long. And it really is just this journey. But I would say, my love of writing started with books, and this is not a line. My first word was book, which
that's amazing.
It's just one of those funny things. But I guess it happened because I wanted my mom to read to me, and I went over and I picked up a book and I was pointing at the rocking chair and I just burst out with book, and she always thought that was such a funny story. But, my first novels really were written in sixth grade, and they were riddled with cliches, I'm sure. And they were all camp romances, and they're probably under the bed somewhere at my parents' house and will possibly be used against me in a hostage situation.
Oh, yeah,
but
sure.
that's where it all started with. You have to write badly to write well. So I started there.
Do. I love that. I think the writing bug can reach us all at different stages in our lives and different times. But I was definitely that same way. I wanted to be a famous author from as early as I can remember. And I remember reading some book, and the author was as a teenager, and I was so jealous. I was like, I'm so far behind. Look at this person. They're 16 and have a published book. But it all happens in our own time. But it's definitely something that, it's so fun. And I love I love passing it down too, to I try and read books, or reading a chapter book together as a family, helping the kids to, retain things from a story, which I feel like can always be hard with focus because they're so used to watching movies or TV shows. But they both do love books too, and I think that's such a fun thing to pass down, is that love of books and love of storytelling.
Yeah, absolutely. With my youngest, I'm reading Kit Rosewater's series, The Derby Daredevils, which the second one just came out in September, and then the third one's going to be coming out later this year. So that's one of the most fun things you can do as a family, or just, reading out loud. I think there's, recently I was thinking about why books are, or have magic of some kind, mm-hmm. especially physical books, and why that magic doesn't always seem to exist in an ebook. And although I read on my Kindle and I listen to audiobooks because it's so much easier to ingest a lot of material that way, but there is something very powerful and very magical to holding a book and reading it out loud.
Definitely. And I feel like some of the magic too, I try and remember when I was a kid, some of the magic too can come from the way your parents read it, the different voices, the way that they set it up to have you listen can be, very magical too. They're a big part of the process, I think.
Absolutely. The cats in our household and the favorite transitional object stuffies all have their own voices in our household. So our house is very full of imaginative voices, and I think that does make the world sort of more colorful and magical.
Yes, I love it. Well, tell me a little bit about your revision process. So I know now you have, your agent and your editor who are very helpful in that process, right? But what do you do yourself before you send it to your agent to kind of make sure everything's in the shape you want it?
So I love this question because I am a big proponent of revision. I like sharing this knowledge. I have so many people who I have learned from over the years, but one of my favorite authors who I took classes with as a graduate student in my MFA program is Jill McCorkle. And she's an adult author. She writes short stories mostly, but has a couple of books out. My favorite book of short stories by her is called Final Vinyl Days, and she talked about revision in a way that I absolutely always remember and love so much, which is writing the first draft is like dating. You get flowers, and I'm paraphrasing here, but you get flowers and champagne and long walks by the ocean or something like that. But the revision is like the marriage, and you're fighting over how much the couch costs, and somebody is not cleaning out the litter box, and somebody else has to change the diaper. And that's really what revision is
Yes.
like, right? I recently did a post on my blog where I talked about why I approach revision as if I'm climbing out of the 9 circles of Dante's Inferno. So, I mean, I do know that it's really hard, but I think sometimes that helps me think about the journey that you have to go on with every book, that you can write a draft, you can do NaNoWriMo, and I have actually written the book that I'm working on right now, not that's coming out next, but that I'm working on right now. I wrote it in about a month. I wrote a first draft in about a month, and that was a year and a half ago.
Yeah.
And I'm still plugging away at it. So I like to think of it moving sort of like, if you know Dante's Inferno, you know that like the lower, the first, level 9 of hell is like the most horrifying. And then as you kind of climb up, making it to limbo, which I don't think that writers ever get out of limbo. That's just where we are forever, because it's just such a difficult kind of place to be, where you're very exposed to criticism. But you start with what I call the chainsaw draft, where you just tear everything apart, and like chapters are being lopped off like heads, and that's just what it looks like. It's just like all blood and gore in level 9, and then as you sort of go from there, I usually move to consistency drafts, then character drafts, working on a subplot draft, a dialogue draft, a continuity draft, a draft for tone, a draft for voice, and usually there's at least between 9 and 12 drafts that I go through. And then when I get to a good enough place where I can kind of read through it, and I'm not sure where to go, I give it to my critique group. And just a shout out to my critique group, the Panama Math and Science Club. They're incredible books coming out, a couple books from Lisa Ramey, who is one of my critique partners. She's written A Good Kind of Trouble and Something to Say, which are both middle grade books. And then another critique partner of mine, Stacey Stokes, has a book coming out next year called The Memory House, which I think is going to be absolutely incredible, which I know it's going to be incredible. And of course, Karina Rocco, former group member, who I've mentioned. But they all will give me this, feedback, which is horrible and thrilling and terrifying. And then I revise again, and I really take a lot of time with it after that critique group draft. And then when I feel like I can read it again, it goes to another beta reader, usually a former critique group member or a fellow writer. And then my last move that I always make that I like a lot, and I recommend to everybody, no matter how the levels of hell look for somebody else, is a format change. So, some people have talked recently about sort of the Comic Sans effect. I always send, and I learned this actually from another wonderful author. It's a good trick to send your manuscript to your Kindle, which you can just get your Kindle email address from your Kindle and then send the manuscript there, and it will just like pop up like a book, and you can read it like it's a book.
Yeah. And
something about reading it like it's a book really helps me see places that don't make sense or that stumble. So that's kind of the last move that I make, and then I kind of make all the changes that I noted, and then often I will read it out loud. And my husband is very long-suffering and will listen to me read books out loud. And my oldest daughter, too, who's only 10, but sometimes she likes to read or listen to what I've written. It's not always appropriate, but I let her do that. And then it's only then that it goes to my agent, and she always has thoughts.
Oh, yes, of course.
And then there's another round of revision, and then to the editor after that. So Yeah, it's a long process.
It's a long process, but it's worth going through that. I don't know how people do NaNoWriMo every single year, because I've done it before, but then I end up working on that what I've written for like 2 or 3 years after. I'm like, okay, I gotta dig in and get it, because there is a lot of drafts that go into it. Well, I love asking that question, just like how, kind of your style of writing, because, for the people listening, or people who maybe are stuck in a revision and don't know where to go next, it helps to give ideas or maybe some inspiration of how to move forward. So thank you for sharing that. That is definitely an apt analogy to the revision process. Well, I have just one last question for you. I have been told by pretty much everybody who's been on this podcast that it is my hardest question. I'd love to know what your favorite book is right now. Not your favorite book of all time, because that's ridiculous. Just a book you've read recently that you really loved.
Yeah, I mean, this is, like, if anybody, I feel like I used to have an answer for, like, your favorite book of all time, but
No.
you just can't. And I think that, like, one of the things I try to remember, especially, like, in the, not just, like, you're a writer, we can think of author as being separate from writer, but as an author and getting reviews and things like that, I always think it's just like when you're a reader, you don't like everything, and not every audience member is going to like what you've written. So, so when I say I like something, it doesn't necessarily mean somebody else is going to love it. But right now, and at any given time, I'm always reading quite a few different things. But some of the things I've recently loved are a very new book called Star Daughter by Shweta Thakkar. And she writes the story of a girl who finds out that she's half star, or that her mom was a star. So it's a really fun reimagining of our world with a magical element. And then I also recently really loved a very incredibly written and very visceral book called Red Hood by Elena K. Arnold, who also wrote the book Damsel. And I'm also rereading Trevor Noah's autobiography, Born a Crime. And this time I'm kind of savoring it. And part of that is he's so funny and painful at the same time. And I think it's great to have these books that you go back to that are ones that nail the kind of writing that you want to do. And I don't write, my own stories, but I think all the books I love are the ones where the deepest pains of our life meet our greatest abilities to cope. Usually it's through using humor or through being vulnerable. And he does both of those things really, really well. Yeah. So that's really where I want my work to be, is making you laugh as I stab you with the painful truths of life and of love.
Yeah.
So that's what I'm reading right now, and the books I recommend. And again, I've just started Nina LaCour's new book, Watch Over Me, but I do already recommend it. And I was lucky enough to hear a little bit of Jandy Nelson's newest book that's going to be coming out hopefully in the next year or two. And that was just incredible too. So shout out to both of them for being awesome.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing those. I mean, there's so many books out there that we inevitably miss something, right? So I love to ask this question, even though it is hard, because I feel like we'll get a little bit more exposure to all the different books that are out there.
Absolutely. You can never have enough on your TBR pile. No. I mean, we just expect it to go all the way to the ceiling these days.
Yes. And we're stuck in our house most of the time, so what's our excuse now, right?
Or get it on audiobook. My big thing is like, hey, if you can't read, get your audiobooks, download it from your library. And I always love the shout out, like, if you don't have the money, especially right now, it's been a tough past year for everybody. If you don't have the money to buy books, the way you can support authors is by requesting books from your local library, and you can email them. Or if they're open, you can stop by and ask them to carry these books. And then you can also ask them to make sure that they get it on audiobook if you want to listen to it. So I always go to your library, support your local libraries.
That is a great tip, and something I have seen a lot of reminders about. Well, thank you. Katherine, thank you so much for chatting with me, telling us all about your wonderful book, Wider Than the Sky, and letting us get to know you a little bit.
Thank you so much, Rose, for having me. I have absolutely enjoyed talking to you today.
Thank you guys so much for listening, and be prepared for so many great episodes this month. I have a ridiculous amount of episodes. You'll get 2 per week for January and February at least, and for quite a few months out of the year. So it's going to be amazing. You guys are going to love all the different authors and agents that are on the podcast. Please make sure to rate and review this podcast where you find it. And if you can't rate and review, make sure you're at least subscribed, and tag me in something on social media at Rose Quinney, QUINNY. Thanks so much.